Lagos was a city of wealth, ambition, and power, where success was measured in towering skyscrapers, AI-driven cars, and luxury that never slept. In the heart of it all was Ella, the queen of fashion, owner of Ella Royale, a multi-million-dollar empire that clothed the elite. She was rich beyond imagination, living in a mansion of glass and steel overlooking the Atlantic, driving a self-navigating Rolls-Royce that whispered her name every morning, dining on meals prepared by robotic chefs who knew her every craving before she did. But none of it compared to the pride she had in her husband, Kenechukwu, a man as powerful as he was handsome. They were the golden couple, the faces of perfection, the ones everyone wanted to be. When Ella became pregnant, Lagos celebrated like royalty had been born. Lavish baby showers filled with diamond-encrusted gifts, international doctors flown in to monitor every stage, a nursery designed by an Italian architect. It had to be perfect because Ella only accepted perfection. The day Jane was born, the world felt complete, but only for a moment. The nurses exchanged glances, the doctor hesitated, the air in the hospital room turned thick with something wrong. Ella's heart pounded as she demanded answers, and when they finally came, her soul cracked. "Your daughter is blind." It felt like a cruel joke, an impossible reality, a mistake that had to be undone. But there was no undoing it. Jane, the child meant to be her greatest blessing, had arrived incomplete. Whispers started before Ella even left the hospital, murmurs between the nurses, the worried looks from family members, the hushed conversations of the household staff who avoided saying Jane's name like it was a forbidden spell. Her mother-in-law was the first to say it outright. "This child is a curse. Bad luck follows children like this. Keep her and you will suffer." Ella fought against the thought, pushing it deep into the part of her mind that refused to accept such beliefs. But Lagos was built on superstition, and superstition had a way of creeping in through the cracks. At first, she ignored the signs, telling herself they were coincidences, but the misfortunes kept coming. Kenechukwa's multi-million-dollar deal collapsed in a single night, investors disappearing as if they had never existed. Ella's factories burned down without warning, killing everyone inside, the flames leaving nothing but ash and an empty graveyard of lost wealth. Her mother-in-law, strong and fierce, fell to a sudden stroke, her last breath forming only one word: Jane. Still Ella tried to hold on. She tried to love her daughter, telling herself Jane was innocent, that a child could not be responsible for disaster. But every time she looked into those empty, unseeing eyes, fear gripped her heart. Every time Jane giggled, the sound sent shivers down Ella's spine, and when the little girl reached for her, calling Mummy, it felt less like a name and more like a curse being spoken aloud. Then the final blow came. Ella had always wanted a big family, children running through the halls, laughter echoing in the vastness of her mansion, but every attempt to conceive after Jane ended in the same way, miscarriage after miscarriage, every child lost before it could take its first breath. It was then she knew. Jane had to go. It wasn't hate, at least not at first. It was desperation, fear, the overwhelming sense that her life was slipping through her fingers like sand in the wind. She convinced herself that it was for the best, that Jane would be better off somewhere else, that this was an act of mercy, not cruelty. Tomorrow she would take Jane far away to a place where no one would ever find her. Tomorrow Jane would be gone. Forever. The morning was beautiful, the golden Lagos sun reflecting off the glass towers, the city buzzing with its usual energy, but inside Ella's mansion the air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. Today was the day. She had thought about it for weeks, convincing herself it was for the best, telling herself that this was the only way, that she had no choice. Yet as she dressed Jane in a soft pink dress, brushing out her curls, adjusting the tiny shoes on her feet, her hands trembled. Jane smiled up at her, blind eyes wide with innocence. "Mummy, where are we going?" Ella forced a smile, her throat dry. "Somewhere special, my love. Just you and me." The little girl beamed, clutching her stuffed bunny, fingers tracing the worn fabric as if sensing something was different, but she didn't ask any more questions. She trusted her mother completely. The AI-powered Rolls-Royce waited outside, its doors opening with smooth efficiency. Ella strapped Jane in, sliding into the driver's seat, the interior wrapping them in silent luxury. The AI system recognized her stress, its soft voice offering calming music, but she declined. She didn't want distractions. The car glided forward, Lagos blurring past in a wash of towering skyscrapers, Digital billboards flashing models wearing her designs, influencers sipping cocktails on rooftop lounges. Everything she had built, everything she had worked for, yet none of it felt real anymore. Jane hummed quietly to herself, swinging her feet against the seat, unaware of the weight pressing against her mother's chest. The city slowly faded behind them, the roads narrowing, the landscape changing. The neatly paved highways turned into rougher roads, the bright sun dimmed by thick, towering trees. The AI car hesitated. Destination unclear. Shall I reroute? Ella's fingers clenched the steering wheel. No. Keep going. The evil forest loomed ahead. It was a place of legends, feared by all, spoken about in hushed tones, a cursed land where spirits roamed freely, where the abandoned never returned. Even the wealthiest in Lagos respected the whispers, keeping their distance, leaving the forest undisturbed. No one dared challenge the unknown. Ella parked at the forest's edge, her breath unsteady. The car doors unlocked with a quiet click, the AI detecting no immediate danger, but it didn't understand what lay ahead. She turned to Jane, studying her soft features, the peaceful expression on her face. Did she know? Could she sense it? Mummy? Jane's voice was soft, uncertain. Why did we stop? Ella swallowed hard, unbuckling her seatbelt. Come, let's take a little walk. She lifted Jane from the car, holding her close, inhaling her scent, committing the warmth of her small body to memory. The moment they stepped into the forest, the air changed. It was colder, the warmth of the Lagos sun swallowed by the thick canopy of ancient trees. The silence was unnatural, absolute. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the sound of their footsteps against the soft earth. Ella's heart pounded, but she forced herself forward. Jane hesitated. Mummy, the ground feels strange. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ella tightened her grip on her daughter's hand. Just a little further, baby. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. The trees stretched high, twisted, their trunks impossibly wide, their branches curling like grasping fingers. It felt alive. Watching. Breathing. The city felt like another world, far away, unreachable. Jane stopped, her head tilting slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. Mummy, who is whispering? Ella's blood turned cold. No one, my love. Just the wind. But there was no wind. She spotted a fallen log and stopped. This was far enough. She knelt beside Jane, brushing her fingers through her daughter's soft curls, her voice shaking despite her effort to stay strong. Jane, wait here for a moment, okay? Jane nodded, her small hands pressing against the rough bark of the log, unaware of the silent tears in her mother's eyes. Ella stood. She turned. She walked. At first it was slow, each step heavier than the last, her heart screaming at her to stop, to turn back, to pick Jane up and take her home. But then her feet moved faster. Faster. Until she was running. Twigs snapped beneath her heels, branches clawing at her dress, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, Jane's voice called out. Mummy? Ella didn't stop. She reached the car, hands shaking as she gripped the door handle. The AI registered her elevated heart rate, offering breathing exercises, but she ignored it. She climbed in, slammed the door shut, pressed her foot to the pedal. The tires spun against the dirt before gripping, the car speeding off, leaving the forest and Jane behind. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The drive home was a blur. The streets of Lagos felt different, colder, as if the city itself knew what she had done. When she stepped into her mansion, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, the temperature unnaturally cool. A vase toppled from the table, crashing into 1,000 pieces. The lights flickered, her phone vibrated with missed calls and messages, and for the first time in years the house felt unfamiliar. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, it brought nightmares. Not of burning factories or lost business deals, not of ruined wealth or whispers in the city. This was different. Darker. She stood in the middle of the forest, surrounded by shadows. The trees stretched endlessly above her, their twisted branches curling into the sky. She wasn't alone. There were figures in the darkness, moving between the trees, unseen but felt. A whisper brushed against her ear, cold as ice. She turned and saw Jane standing there. The pink dress was the same. The stuffed bunny still clutched in her tiny hands. But her blind eyes glowed. Mummy, why did you leave me? The forest breathed. The shadows shifted. Ella woke with a scream. The room was freezing. The corners too dark. The air too thick. She pulled the blanket tight around her, her pulse hammering, her breaths shallow. It was just a dream. It had to be. But deep inside she knew. The spirits had taken her. She had left Jane in their world. And now they knew her name. The forest was not silent. It was never silent. It only seemed that way to those who did not belong, but for Jane the whispers were clear. The moment her mother left, the air shifted, the trees breathed, the ground beneath her feet pulsed like a heartbeat. She waited. At first she expected to hear footsteps returning, to feel warm arms lifting her, to hear her mother's voice telling her it was just a game. But the minutes stretched, the cold deepened, and realization settled into her small body like ice. She was alone. But not for long. Something moved in the trees, not a rustle, not a break of a branch, but a shift, like the air itself had weight and it was pressing closer. Jane did not cry. She clutched her stuffed bunny tighter, tilting her head as she listened. The whispers were soft at first, like wind playing through leaves, but then they became clearer. She left you. The voice curled around her ears, gentle, almost kind. She abandoned you. Another voice, this one deeper, almost like a song humming through her bones. But you are not alone. Jane did not flinch. He did not scream. Her sightless eyes blinked, her small hands gripping the fabric of her dress. Who are you? Her voice was steady. The whispers shifted, murmuring among themselves. A child of the forgotten, left in our arms. Do you fear us? Jane shook her head. No. And so the forest embraced her. The roots beneath her feet pulsed with warmth. The cold air wrapped around her like a blanket. The trees themselves seemed to lean in closer, cradling her presence. Shadows moved without bodies, but Jane felt no danger. She had never seen the world with her eyes, so the darkness did not scare her. She only knew warmth and cold, kindness and cruelty. This place, though strange, was not cruel. It did not leave her. It did not lie to her. We will teach you. Time did not pass the same way in the forest. The days were not counted, the nights did not end. Jane grew not in years but in knowing. The whispers became voices, the shadows became shapes, and soon she could hear them not just in her ears but inside her mind. They spoke of the world beyond the trees, the world of men who feared what they did not understand. They told her of power, of the secrets that ran beneath the skin of the earth, of the knowledge hidden in the dark. And Jane listened. She learned to move without sound, to hear more than words, to understand the language of the unseen. Her hands no longer searched blindly for objects. She knew where things were before she touched them. The forest did not just shelter her, it changed her. She was no longer just a girl. She was something else. One night, as the sky above the forest darkened to an endless black, the voices whispered with excitement. It is time. Jane stood in the center of the clearing, her bare feet pressed against the cold earth, her blind eyes unblinking. She could feel it, something shifting in the air, a door opening between what was and what would be. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form flickering like smoke, its presence pressing against her skin. What do you desire? The voice was not like the others. It was not a whisper but a presence, a force that moved through the ground, the trees, the wind itself. Jane tilted her head. I want to go home. The whispers rustled in excitement. The figure stepped closer. Do you have a home? Jane was silent for a long moment. Then softly she said, I had a mother once. The voices did not laugh. They did not mock. They understood. Then we will give you a new name. A name of power. A name of knowing. A name that cannot be taken. Jane felt a warmth spread through her, something ancient, something beyond human understanding. The whispers surrounded her, filling her ears, her mind, her body. The name they gave her was not something spoken. It was something felt, something that vibrated in the deepest part of her being. And when the transformation was complete, she was no longer just Jane. She was something more. The next morning she stood at the edge of the forest, her black eyes absorbing the world in ways no human could understand. She could hear the city in the distance, its hum of life, its endless hunger for power and wealth. But she did not belong to that world anymore. She belonged to the ones who had never left her. The spirits. The forgotten. The unseen. Yet there was unfinished business. Her mother. The woman who had abandoned her, left her for dead, convinced herself that Jane was a curse. Ella had moved on but Jane had not. and neither had the spirits. It is time to return, and so she walked. Not with fear. Not with hesitation. But with purpose. Because she was no longer the little blind girl left in the woods. She was something else entirely. And she was going home. Lagos was still the same, the city of wealth, power, and ambition, but for Ella it was different now. The same streets that once felt alive with energy now felt suffocating. The mansion she once loved felt haunted, its halls colder than before, its silence heavier. It had been years since she left Jane in the forest, yet the memory clung to her like a shadow she couldn't escape. She told herself she had done the right thing, that Jane was a curse, that the spirits had taken her as payment for all the misfortunes that had fallen upon her. But deep inside she knew she had committed an unforgivable sin. Her once glorious empire was in ruins. Ella Royale, the fashion house that had once dressed Lagos' wealthiest, had crumbled overnight. First it was a lost shipment worth millions, then a fire that destroyed an entire warehouse. Lawsuits followed, then financial scandals. Investors pulled out and soon she was drowning in debts she never thought possible. She tried to rebuild but every effort failed. Her once loyal business partners avoided her, whispering that she was cursed. The whispers started as rumors in the elite circles but soon spread like wildfire. She carries the mark of the forsaken. It wasn't just her business. It was her home. The mansion, once filled with light and the sound of laughter, had turned into something dark, something hollow. No matter how many housekeepers she hired, dust settled too quickly, the mirrors became clouded and the walls felt like they were closing in. The silence in the halls was no longer comforting. It was watching. The air smelled different, like damp earth and something else, something rotten. The nights were worse. At first it was just dreams. She would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, sweat dripping down her back. In those dreams she was always back in the forest, surrounded by towering trees, the air thick with whispers. And then she would see her. Always standing in the same pink dress, clutching the same stuffed bunny. But her face was different. No longer innocent. No longer human. Her blind eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and though she never spoke, Ella could hear her voice inside her head. "Mummy, why did you leave me?" Then the dreams followed her into reality. It started small, doors unlocking by themselves, furniture moving an inch out of place. The mirrors no longer reflected her properly. Sometimes she would walk past and see something else. Something behind her, something waiting. Then came the voices. Soft, close, familiar. At night she would hear footsteps in the hallway, but whenever she checked there was no one there. One night she woke up gasping for breath. The air was freezing, her blanket damp with sweat. As she reached for her bedside lamp, her hand brushed against something soft. Her body went rigid. Slowly she turned on the light and her breath caught in her throat. The stuffed bunny. The same one Jane had held onto the last time Ella saw her. The one she had abandoned with her child in the heart of the forest. It sat there on her pillow facing her, its button eyes staring. Ella scrambled out of bed, shoving the toy to the floor, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Someone was in the house. Someone had broken in. She called security, but when they checked, nothing was missing. The cameras showed nothing. There was no break-in, no sign of forced entry. And yet, the next night the bunny was there again. And the night after that. She stopped sleeping. She stopped eating. Her weight dropped, her eyes darkened with exhaustion. The house felt smaller every day, pressing against her. She avoided mirrors entirely, afraid of what she might see. The whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper, and the voice became clearer. "Mummy, I'm coming home." She tried to leave. She packed a bag, booked a flight, determined to escape, to anywhere as far as possible. But the moment she stepped out of the mansion, the world tilted. The sky turned an unnatural shade of gray, the air thickened, and her body refused to move forward. It was as if invisible hands held her in place, as if something unseen whispered directly into her bones. The trees outside her mansion bent slightly, their leaves rustling in words only she could hear. "You cannot run." That night the city was wrapped in a storm. The sky cracked with thunder, the rain poured in violent sheets, the power flickered. The security alarms blared suddenly, piercing through the mansion with a high-pitched warning. The guards rushed to the front gates, expecting robbers, expecting intruders. But no one had broken in. Glad she stood there. A woman. Moving. Silent. She stood just beyond the gates, her skin dark as midnight, her figure striking, her presence wrong in a way that made the air too thick to breathe. Her eyes were black. Completely black. Endless. And then she smiled. A slow, knowing smile. The mansion doors unlocked on their own. Ella stood frozen at the top of the staircase, her breath shallow. She couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't scream. The woman walked inside with quiet, deliberate steps, her long fingers trailing along the marble walls as the lights flickered violently. The air became heavy, pressing against Ella's chest. The guards tried to react, raising their weapons, but before they could even lift their guns, they collapsed. One by one they fell to the floor, their bodies limp as if the life had been drained from them. Their eyes remained open, unblinking, their mouths slightly parted as if they had tried to scream but never got the chance. Ella trembled. She wanted to run, wanted to hide, but her feet refused to move. The woman, no, not a woman. Something else lifted her head slowly, her gaze locking onto Ella's. The storm outside raged on, thunder shaking the windows, but inside there was nothing but silence. Then she spoke. "Mummy." Ella felt her stomach drop. She knew that voice. She knew it deep in her bones. And she knew without a doubt that Jane had returned. The mansion was silent, but the air inside it carried a weight so heavy that it pressed against Ella's chest, making it hard to breathe. The storm raged outside, rain hammering against the glass windows, thunder rolling through the sky, but inside, everything was still. The woman standing at the entrance was no ordinary visitor. She had not knocked, had not announced herself, yet she was here inside Ella's home, inside the one place that should have been safe. The guards lay sprawled on the marble floor, their bodies unmoving, their eyes open yet lifeless, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Ella gripped the railing of the staircase, her knuckles white, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to flee into the darkness, but her legs refused to move. The woman lifted her chin slightly, the same slow, eerie smile still stretched across her lips. The blackness of her eyes was endless, a void that swallowed the very air around her. The shadows in the room shifted, moving as if they were alive, stretching unnaturally across the floors and walls. "Mummy," the woman whispered again, her voice soft but carrying something beneath it, something ancient, something powerful. The word sent a violent shiver down Ella's spine, her knees buckling slightly. It was her voice. Jane's voice. Grown, matured, filled with something dark and unrecognizable. Ella shook her head, stepping backward, her mind screaming that this was impossible, that this could not be real. Jane was dead. She had been taken by the forest, consumed by whatever spirits lurked in the shadows of that cursed place. Yet here she was, standing before her, alive, but not the child she had abandoned. Ella's voice cracked, barely audible over the raging storm. "Jane." The woman tilted her head slightly, considering her as if she were an insect beneath her gaze. Then with slow, deliberate steps she moved forward. The house groaned as she walked, the chandeliers above flickering, the very foundation of the mansion seeming to tremble beneath her presence. Ella stumbled back, clutching her chest, her heartbeat erratic, her mind filled with nothing but terror. "Did you think I would not return?" Jane's voice was like a whisper wrapped in ice, laced with something that was neither human nor kind. "Did you think they would keep me forever?" She reached out her hand and the shadows stretched toward Ella like long fingers, curling around her ankles, creeping up her legs. "Did you think you could leave me?" Ella gasped, her body frozen in place as the shadows gripped her like invisible chains, holding her in place. She struggled, but the darkness clung to her, sinking into her skin, pulling her down. Her breath came in short, frantic gasps, her mind unable to process the horror unfolding before her. "I was only 5, Jane whispered, stepping closer, her eyes locked onto Ella's with something unreadable. 5 years old when you left me to die." Her voice did not rise, did not break, but carried something heavier than rage, deeper than sorrow. "Do you know what happens to a child left in the dark?" Ella whimpered, shaking her head violently, tears spilling down her face. I had no choice. There is always a choice," Jane interrupted, the shadows around her growing thicker, swallowing the room in darkness. "You chose power. You chose wealth. You chose your own comfort over your own blood." The air in the room became thick, suffocating, pressing against Ella's lungs until every breath was a struggle. Ella fell to her knees, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Jane, please," she sobbed, reaching out toward her daughter, toward the girl she had abandoned. "Please forgive me. I was scared. I thought." Jane's expression did not change, did not soften. The house shook violently, a crack forming across the grand marble floor, splitting toward Ella like a jagged wound. "You thought I was a curse," Jane said, her voice now laced with something heavier, something darker. "You thought you could throw me away and keep your perfect life." She took another step forward, her presence now towering over Ella. "But tell me, Mummy, did you find happiness? Did you find peace?" Ella sobbed, shaking her head, her hands clutching at the floor as if the earth beneath her could somehow hold her together. "No," she whispered. "No, I lost everything." Her voice was broken, filled with regret, but Jane did not move, did not blink. "Then you understand," Jane whispered, kneeling in front of her mother, tilting her head slightly as if listening to something unseen. The air around them hummed, vibrating with something unseen, something that existed beyond human comprehension. "You understand what it means to be abandoned. To be unwanted." Ella's body trembled as Jane's fingers brushed against her cheek, cold as ice, sending a violent shudder through her bones. "Please," Ella whispered again, her breath shaking, her vision blurring. "Please, my daughter." Jane smiled then, but it was not a smile of warmth. It was empty, hollow, filled with something ancient, something not meant for this world. "You are not my mother," she whispered, and then the shadows swallowed them both. The storm outside raged on, but by morning the mansion was empty. The grand halls stood still, the luxurious furniture untouched, the mirrors cracked as if something had shattered through them from the inside. The security guards were never found, their bodies vanished as if they had never existed. And Ella Royale, the once great fashion mogul, was gone. The city whispered about her disappearance, some saying she had fled the country, others saying she had finally gone mad. But the mansion remained abandoned, untouched, avoided by all who passed. The gates rusted, the gardens overgrew, the windows blackened with dust. And sometimes, on the darkest nights when the wind was just right, those who walked past swore they could hear a voice, soft, distant, whispering through the air. "Mummy,